Brothers and sisters, our New Testament reading this evening is from Matthew's Gospel, from the 22nd chapter, and we're going to read the first 14 verses of that chapter. Once more, Jesus spoke to them in parables, saying, "The kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who gave a wedding banquet. He sent his slaves to call those who had been invited to the wedding banquet, but they would not come. Again, he sent other slaves, saying, 'Tell those who have been invited, look, I've prepared my dinner. My oxen and my fat calves have been slaughtered, and everything is ready. Come to the wedding banquet.' But they made light of it and went away, one to his farm, another to his business, while the rest seized his slaves, maltreated them, and killed them. The king was enraged. He sent his troops, destroyed those murderers, and burned their city. Then he said to his slaves, 'The wedding is ready, but those invited were not worthy. Go therefore into the main streets and invite everyone you find to the wedding banquet.' Those slaves went out into the streets and gathered all whom they found, both good and bad. So the wedding hall was filled with guests. But when the king came in to see the guests, he noticed a man there who was not wearing a wedding robe. And he said to him, 'Friend, how did you get in here without a wedding robe?' And he was speechless. Then the king said to the attendants, 'Bind him hand and foot and throw him into the outer darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. For many are called, but few are chosen.'" This is the word of God for the people of God. Yeah, maybe. So, as I mentioned, this is the passage, famous verse in it, for many are called, but few are chosen. But what I would just like to look at a little bit here is, you can see there was a king figure, and there's a son who's getting married, and then there's a crowd of people, and then there's this strange figure who shows up inappropriately dressed, and all sorts of bad things happen. If you were to think in your head that the king there is God, then this is a very scary story. We're told the king, who in your mind might think represents God, the king was enraged. He sent his troops, destroyed those murders, burned their city. So there's like a hell and damnation element to that, if the character is supposed to represent God. And then there's the way that the king, you might think represents God, treats this person who's dressed inappropriately. Bind him hand and foot and throw him into the outer darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. I don't know whether that all sounds like the God you imagine. It doesn't sound very much like the God I imagine. Yeah. So this is another one of those parables of Jesus is set in and around the temple here. And you will notice in the parable, when Jesus tells the story, he says, the kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who gave a wedding banquet for his son. He doesn't say the kingdom of heaven is like a wedding banquet. He said you can compare them. And maybe if you compare them, they'll be very similar. Or maybe if you compare them, they might be very different. So we have to be a little bit careful here what we do with this. Also, when you get home tonight, just go up to the table by your bed and get your Greek New Testament and open that up to this particular verse and take a look. And where in our translation, we have Jesus say, the kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who gave a wedding banquet for his son. If you just translate the words one at a time, it says the kingdom of the heavens has been likened to a man king. Two nouns, one after the other. A man king who has made a wedding for his son. It's almost like Jesus, when he's telling this story, he actually used words like that, is trying to make sure that you don't think that the king is God. It's a man king. And if there's one thing that God definitely isn't, it's a man. We know that actually says that in the Bible, in the book of Numbers. God is not a man. It says it quite explicitly. So there must be something else going on here. And in fact, one author writing about this, a commentator, says that this is a sort of trap that it's easy to fall into. There's a king, he's inviting people to a wedding feast. It's a wedding feast for his son. And so automatically you think, oh, this is about God inviting people to sort of a symbolic wedding feast of Jesus. It seems sort of obvious here. But then he says one doesn't have to push that metaphor too far to reach a breaking point. And he's quite right about that. As we've already seen, it casts an image of God who sets up this hellfire and damnation situation here. And the author goes on to comment on this business of having two nouns next to each other. I'd suggest that when we put together the passive voice of likened and the double noun man king, we could say that Jesus begins this parable with, people often describe the kingdom of heaven as if God were like Herod. So the man king in this story is not supposed to be God, it's supposed to be the powers that be, Herod, the Romans, whatever it might be. Similarly, we have powers to be today. And the idea is that you compare and contrast the world that those powers that be, the man king, have set up, and what the kingdom of God is supposed to look like, and you compare them. It doesn't mean that they're like each other. In this case, it means they're very different from each other. The reference here, there's a sort of caution about this in the book of Isaiah, the book we're reading in Bible study here. If you're going to compare God to something or liken God to something, Isaiah says, well, you better watch your step and do that. To whom then will you liken God, or what likeness compare? I mean, how can you do that? There's somebody, maybe a person, a king, a prince, whatever, a president, you compare them to God, really? To whom will you liken me, says God in Isaiah 46, make me equal and compare me as though we were alike. So comparing God and having God represented by human figures is dangerous business, according to Isaiah here. Now, the man king in this story, the human powers that be, invite people to come and sort of be part of their team. They send their slaves out, the man king sends his slaves out to call those who have been invited to join in with the festivities put on by this man king here. But the people don't go. So, the next thing that happens is that enticements are offered here. He sends out other slaves saying, look what we're going to have for dinner. Now, it might sound particularly appealing to you, I don't know. It's somebody who's a vegetarian, it doesn't sound very appealing to me, I'll tell you, but he's got his oxen and his fatted calves, and they've been slaughtered and prepared for this feast. And remember, everybody around, these are not folks who get to eat meat. That would be very rare that they could sit down and eat meat, particularly great piles of it from a slaughtered ox, a bunch of fatted calves. That's an extraordinary inducement. It's an invitation to go live the good life, even if only for a short while, provided you go and be part of what the man king has got going on. So this invitation, though, is rejected. They make light of this here, and the people go about their everyday business. One goes to his farm, or to his shop or his business, and then some of them seize these slaves, maltreat them, and kill them. So the man king is initially ignored and scorned, sometimes violently. The response from the man king is that the king was enraged, and he sends his troops out. They kill all the people who are involved in mistreating and killing the slaves. They burn the city to the ground here. This is almost like an anticipation of what will happen in Jerusalem when the man king and his backers, Rome, react to any type of rejection by the people. You remember eventually, shortly after the story of Jesus, that the people in Jerusalem rebel against the Romans. And what the Romans do is what the Romans have always done. They send their legions in and they say, kill everybody and burn everything. So, and then there's a plan B that the man king rolls out here. He says, well, look, everything's ready. The people who I've invited are not showing up and joining in. So go and just bring everybody in. Gather everyone you can find, the good and the bad. It's like the good, the bad, the ugly. Get everybody, bring them all in. And so they're all lured into this sumptuous feast in the end, whether they're good people or bad people. Everybody gets dragged in here. The wedding hall is filled with people here, enjoying the hospitality of the man king, the person who has just moments ago sent his troops out to burn a city to the ground and kill everybody who was in it. But the but in the story is that there's one person in the room who won't play the game. He notices a man there who's not wearing a wedding robe, and he says to him, how did you get here without a wedding robe? And then we're told, and he was speechless. So who's the he in the story? Is it the king who's speechless, or is it this guy who's not dressed in a wedding robe? Is it him who's, somebody who's speechless? Who is it? Well, in the image of the suffering servant in the book of Isaiah, we see the passage that comes following that statement is that this strange individual who's dressed inappropriately is bound hand and foot, thrown into the outer darkness, lots of weeping, lots of gnashing of teeth. And that sounds just like the suffering servant passages in Isaiah. And the reference to being speechless, you will see what we're really talking about here is the person who's not dressed for the wedding feast. In Isaiah 53, this is the image of a suffering servant, he was oppressed, was afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. Speechless, he didn't say anything. Like a lamb that's led to the slaughter, and like a sheep that before it shears is silent. So he did not open his mouth. And by perversion of justice, he's taken away. In the parable, we read, he is speechless, and in Isaiah, references to the suffering servant always have him as speechless here. Jesus concludes this parable with, many are called, but few are chosen. And just as it is with Isaiah's suffering servant, there are many people who could have stood up to be counted in the face of the man king, who, remember, had just ordered an entire city to be burned to the ground. They could have stood up and been counted. But at the end of the day, very few people will do that. And in this story, only one actually does. It's to this situation that the kingdom of heaven may be compared. Not because it's meant to be like this wedding banquet, but like it's supposed to be the opposite of this wedding banquet. So in this parable, you have a leader. You can map this onto contemporary politics today very easily. There is a leader whose approach to getting you onto his team is, first of all, he offers a carrot. And the carrot in the story is a sumptuous feast that you would never, ever be able to provide for yourself. There's the carrot. If the carrot doesn't work to get you onto his team, then out comes the stick. The king was enraged, sends his troops. People are killed, the city is burned to the ground. Now, despite the initial opposition and resistance, some people do get swept in by the man king here. It doesn't mean that they were good people or bad people. Lots of people just get swept in here. The good and the bad are brought under the influence of the man king. And in opposition to the man king, there is but one who stands up and speaks without saying any words. In resistance, the one who is different from everybody else, who stands out from the crowd here, makes no attempt to blend in, and no attempt to look or act like everyone else. And he winds up paying the price for being different from everybody else and standing up. In the big crowd that's been lured in by the man king, only one of them stands out, and that one winds up being bound hand and foot, thrown into the outer darkness where there's weeping and gnashing of teeth. Surely he knew, if he'd seen what the man king had done, burning entire cities to the ground and so on, that pain and suffering would be the result of his actions. And so what you see in this story is the tactics that the man king uses. The man king as a representative of Rome, Herod, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the leaders of the temple. It's the power structure of the world. So does it sound at all familiar in today's politics? They want to get you on their side, so they offer you the carrot. If the carrot doesn't work, watch out, because the stick's coming. And following on from the stick comes bullying. And after the bullying comes outright violence. Does it sound familiar in recent times in American politics here? And the point is that those are the sorts of tactics that the bad guys use. And the kingdom, we're asked to compare to this. And you see that the kingdom uses none of these tactics whatsoever. When God invites you into the kingdom, the only possible thing you could say that's similar is, well, maybe there's a carrot. And the carrot is this. The carrot is that you're invited to live a life not where there are sumptuous feasts and foods that you can't afford and will never be able to have, but instead live in a world where people actually love each other. And you remember love here, what does it mean? It means to will the good of the other, even above and beyond your own. It's a place in which there will be, on occasion, sparks of joy. It's a place in which there will be peace, not just peace in the sense of absence of conflict. No more man kings burning down cities, although that will be part of it, but instead shalom, wholeness, completeness in a community, a place in which we are patient and kind to each other, in which we are generous with that which we have, where we exhibit faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. This is what the kingdom offers, and it is in stark contrast to what the man king offers, the carrot, the stick, the bullying, the violence here. So these are the tactics of the man king. They were alive and well at the time of Jesus, and they are alive and well today. You will see them if you follow the rich and powerful in political structures today, all of these techniques used as a way to try and rope you in, to draw you in. And Jesus, making no attempt to look like or sound like or be like any of those figures, comes in and offers this. And the thing about it is that option is available for many, many, many people. But very few wind up choosing or being chosen to participate in it, depending upon whether you look at it that God chooses you to be part of it, or whether you think you made the choice to live that type of life, guided by the gift of the Spirit, the gifts of the kingdom, offered to a lot of people. Very few wind up doing it. We know, when we talk about being chosen, ultimately in Matthew's gospel, we hear God speak about Jesus saying, "Here is my servant whom I have chosen, my beloved with whom my soul is well pleased." And what does God do when he chooses somebody? "I will put my spirit upon him, and he will do a certain job." What is the job if you're chosen by God? It is proclaim justice to all the nations, which is another way you could express the word Gentiles, all the nations, all the peoples. Proclaim justice to all the peoples. And so in this image, in this particular parable, where we have a very unusual looking Jesus figure, the message here is that when you have a servant who has been chosen, that servant who has been chosen is beloved of God, God is well pleased, but the servant is given a job to do, and the job is to proclaim justice. And the type of justice that's being proclaimed here is the type of justice you can understand when you see the law viewed through a lens of grace. That's what justice looks like in the New Testament. Law viewed through the lens of grace. And so that law viewed through the lens of grace winds up giving you a situation where we have those gifts of the Spirit, gifts of the kingdom that we just looked at, love and joy and peace, and kindness, gentleness, and so on, as the model for how we're to live our lives together. I think today it's very easy to forget that because we get bombarded with political messages of all types, or messages from the industrial complex of all types. And it's very easy to be lured in either by the carrot or by the stick or by the bullying. And sometimes that descends into outright violence. In contrast to that, Jesus is the one who proclaims justice, law through the lens of grace, and encourages us to live lives. It's really not, is it as hard as it sounds, to love each other, to will the good of another? That's what we're being encouraged to do here. So watch out when you come across one of these man-king figures. Watch out for the carrot, the stick, the bullying, and the outright violence.